my sister wives that I'm leaving.
For as long as I can remember, apology had been currency. It greased the Confederation. It kept the conversational ball rolling. Balance had been restored, at least in appearance. But in the sister wives universe, apologies could never accomplish that. Apologies had nothing to do with guilt in this world and its condoned imbalances. They had only one function: survival. Apologizing was harmless at first. It was even generous. It was even what it meant to be grown up. It was what it meant to compromise. Apologizing became reflexive, particularly in times of strong emotions. Apologizing was simpler than excusing. Apologizing was simpler than standing firm. With the passage of time, however, a subtle shift took. Apologies ceased to be answers that came after mistakes. They began to come as prevention. They began to come as a means of preventing someone from feeling uncomfortable. Needs gave way to apologies. The boundaries yielded to apologies. Truth itself gave way to apologies. That's when the cost in emotion started. The sisters did not realize it all at once. No one ever does. The erosion of feelings takes place gradually. This is how it hides, as patience, as empathy, as strength. Silence and adaptability are rewarded, and all the more so if one values peace over justice. The more flexible a person is, the more flexible they are expected to be. Apologies were a part of this adjustment. I am sorry for needing more. Sorry for feeling hurt. I apologize again for mentioning this incident. Sorry for reacting. I'm sorry for taking up space. Eventually, the word lost all meaning, not because it was dishonest, but because it was used too often where it wasn't needed. The sisters weren't apologizing for the pain. They were apologizing for being truthful. That's when something in them pushed back. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just an internal discomfort that gradually built with each automatically issued apology. A pause after saying it. A tiny question that followed. What am I really apologizing for? As the days went by, the sisters began to recognize the patterns. Who apologized first? Who apologized for the most? Who apologized simply because they were the recipient of hurt rather than the source? It was not extreme, but it was consistent. Apologies flowed in only one direction, and effort flowed with them. A person who apologizes all the time takes ownership not only of his own behavior, but of the mood that surrounds him. He becomes the guardians of comfort, mood regulators, tension managers. That's draining, especially when it's not a two-way street. The sisters had quietly borne this role for many years. Instead, the problem was that they were always ignored. They did not cause anything to happen. They did not instigate anything related to mutual accountability. They simply started the wheels turning and all just went as before. That was how the realization dawned on me. Apologies were not solving conflicts. They were putting it off. They weren't fostering comprehension. They were keeping out of balance. It wasn't an easy situation to overlook once the truth was made aware. The sisters started noticing how often they apologized before others even asked, how quickly they mitigated their own comments, how often they downplayed how they felt in order to prevent an argument. They realized how heavily this behavior had been conditioned. And so, with this understanding, a new discomfort arose. Innocence, however, not anger, clarity. They began experimenting, tentatively at first, in small moments where apologies were not given, where a feeling was expressed and it was finished, where a boundary was maintained without it being softened, where silence was allowed to be silence rather than filled with comfort. The outcome was very revealing. The end of the world did not happen. The relationship did not immediately break. However, the dynamic changed. Without the automatic apologies, discomfort arose. People talked more slowly. People waited longer for the tension to dissipate. And the tension revealed what was always present, the understanding that the sisters could fix all of this. They had been the emotional shock absorbers, and they were now moving out of that function. This wasn't about becoming cold and unkind. It wasn't, you see, about avoiding accountability. The sisters apologized when they hurt people. They apologized when words hurt people. They apologized when mistakes happened. But they no longer apologized for emotions, for needs, for reactions based on truth. They learned the difference. It was the start of the revolution but because apologies began to happen by design and no longer automatically, the sisters started to experience something that they had not felt in a long time. Grounded. They weren't emotionally preparing anymore. They weren't shortening mid-sentence. They weren't leaving their truth to keep it comfortable. Living life unapologetically did not make them harder. They became more defined. And then, of course, there is clarity. And once you have it, it is hard to let it go. As soon as the sisters became aware of when they apologized as a habit and not a matter of obligation, they were unable to overlook it. This consciousness followed them from conversations to silence, to moments that passed by unreflectingly. Thus, they sensed the weight of the years in the midst of that pause. They had come to understand how deeply they had embedded apology in their feeling of security. Apologizing was, in their experience, more than just being polite. Apology was safety. It was protection.
These thoughts of apology resonated in me, as they themselves had also started to realize what it was about their experience in White Center that had made them feel more secure. However, shields do weigh a lot when you're always carrying them with them. The sisters began to understand that they weren't apologizing for behavior. They were apologizing for impact that wasn't in their control. Impact on how someone else felt, how reactions were influenced by history, how discomfort came about simply because the truth was told. This was a very disconcerting moment. If this trait were to be eliminated, what would be the result? Would conflicts escalate? Would they be classified as difficult? Would love be withdrawn? These fears were not just theoretical, they had been learned, formed through the accumulation of years in which happiness had been conditioned on their ability to yield before another. Thus, the sisters proceeded gradually. They did not proclaim a change of course. They did not set themselves a set of rules to follow. They let moments elapse with no apology when no apology was due. They let words stand alone without following up with a comment that qualified what they had just said, and thereby often neutralized it. Initially, the resulting silence was a little awkward. Too loud, extremely vulnerable. They were accustomed to filling it. But an interesting thing happened when they didn't. It was filled by some other persons, occasionally out of defensiveness, occasionally out of confusion, occasionally out of attempts to steer the conversation in a different direction, but rarely out of curiosity, rarely out of accountability. It was a pattern that spoke louder than words ever could. The sisters realized that apologies had been doing a lot of behind-scenes work. They had been acting as buffers in conversations, absorbing the shock of emotions, making it easy for imbalance to be maintained. Without this safety net, the truth was all the more painful. And truth makes them uncomfortable because they have always known comfort. This is when the sisters realized the vital lesson that living a life of always saying the apologies would impact the way they are viewed. People might find them colder, more distant, less accommodating. But for the first time, that possibility didn't feel threatening, since the stigma of being labeled as easy had already cost them too much. They also noticed the difference in their own feelings afterwards. As they didn't always apologize, they didn't experience the familiar dip in energy, that little bit of self-effacement, that quiet awareness of having handed something away that didn't need to be handed away. Instead, they were left with a sense of, I noticed this because that feeling, it brought back to mind that self-respect does not shout. It does not require recognition. It merely refuses to be silenced. Days went by and the sisters found themselves growing comfortable with discomfort, to theirs and others. They no longer hurried to ease upset emotions not belonging to them. They let misunderstandings be without fixing them right away. This did not lead to chaos. It brought clarity. They understood what kind of relationships could support honesty without falling apart, what people needed to apologize to in order to keep being comfortable, where accountability was flowing both ways, and where accountability was not flowing at all. But in a manner similar to how the gift kid sees, I now understand that they ceased to couch themselves as the problem. Apologies over the years reinforced a subtle message. If I am uncomfortable, I must be doing something wrong. And now this message started to break down. They realized that discomfort may be a signal, and it is not a failure. It was this understanding that altered their movement within the world. They spoke more clearly. There were fewer self-corrected pauses. They believed their instincts rather than doubting them. Yet living apologetic-free did not make relationship building simpler. It made them truthful. And then the truth, when it makes its appearance, begins to change all that it touches.
The more they lived with the habit of truthfulness, the more the sisters noticed a subtle change in their inner topography. They were not preparing themselves to speak a word. They were not censoring their thoughts in order not to be embarrassed themselves. The words uttered are more direct, more straightforward, without the conventional veil of protection around them. That was a risky approach, given how simple it was. Without a qualification to soften the blow, the words carried their full weight. Emotions came with no hedge around them. Statements contained their boundaries, with no apology tags on them. And that was how unpredictable responses followed. In some corners, the talk died down. Some people grew tense. Some lasted shorter than they used to. However, none of them cheated. They were beginning to learn the ways in which apologies had sometimes operated as a form of emotional insurance. This meant that the message would be assured of having the obligation, or the burden, remain with the sender. Taking away the insurance meant an imbalance in the responsibility. Not everyone was pleased with that. However, this discomfort was not accompanied by aggression from the sisters. There was complete silence. They did not rush to reassure. They did not pursue knowledge. They didn't transform their truth into something more palatable in order for them to accept it. They allowed the reactions to belong to the people experiencing the reactions. It was something new. They had long known how to react quickly to a shifting emotion, to reassure, to explain, to ensure something was not left unanswered. Now they let a conversation dangle. They let a feeling be present without resolution. They learned to let some things wait until tomorrow. This was a transformative experience for me. It set them free from the mindset that harmony needs to be consciously preserved. They learned that the secret to stability lies not within the smooth function, but within the resilience, in the power to resist the uncomfortable, to resist the fall. The sisters also realized how frequently apologies had been used to bypass accountability. If a person was given an apology, that was the end of the conversation. There wasn't a need to reflect or a need to look at patterns either. Without apology, these moments remained open. But open moments require engagement. Some individuals accepted this challenge. They listened, they asked questions, they made changes. These relationships grew, becoming mutual. They became rooted. However, it was taken as a lack of apology, as aggression, as withdrawal, as a shift in personality. But the sisters knew better. They have not grown harder, they have grown more attuned. That harmony was apparent everywhere. They stopped talking about why something hurt. They stopped minimizing reactions. They stopped the process of translating truth into palatable form. Instead, they spoke clearly and left it to the listener to meet the speakers where they were. This trust was considered radical. It was a subtle but powerful shift in the balance of strength. They were not negotiating their value anymore in each encounter. Emotional labor was not necessary anymore. To live without apologies does not mean to live without care, I once said. It was the ability to exist without the erasure. This was important as it made all. They apologized when they hurt others, when they misunderstood, when they reacted out of fear rather than understanding. Apologies had been different this time. They had been rooted, specific, and authentic. They had not been automatic. They had been earned. And because these were earned, they meant a lot. The sisters could feel how light they were, not because living was easy for them, but because it wasn't out of sync with itself. They weren't fighting themselves every second of every day. They weren't saying one thing while meaning something else. They were complete. And it's not something for which wholeness apologizes. As wholeness enveloped them, it became apparent that fear had influenced much of communication in their relationship. Fear of misunderstanding, fear of being perceived as difficult, fear of disturbing a precarious status quo, where it seemed their adaptability was what kept everything in balance. Living without apologies did not eliminate these fears right away, of course, but it no longer allowed itself to be led by fear. They understood how often they'd apologized in advance of any potential response, how many times they'd toned down their own needs before anyone even called them into question. That preliminary apologizing had conditioned others to wait before speaking, Sedaris writes. Without them, something very important changed. People spoke more slowly. There was more space between the words, more space for listening, more space where no one leaped into solving and defending. To begin with, this felt very awkward, as if I had learned a new rhythm after all these years of following another person's beat. However, awkwardness is very often the door to change. The sisters realized that when they didn't apologize, they were heard better. People stopped treating their comments as an outpouring of emotion, a sentiment that had to be comforted and reassured. Sometimes there was a difference of opinion, yes, but it was a difference of opinion without a dismissal. Margaret Gridley, Apologia 2, The Healing Experience. It felt respectful. They also noticed how apologies used to cloud accountability. It was difficult to say where the blame ever belonged since everything was watered down in apologies. With the clear communication that was established, the blame went where it actually belonged. This wasn't always comfortable. Some people had trouble adjusting. They were accustomed to their discomfort being cushioned. They believed that emotional cushioning needed to happen as part of all interactions. If not, they felt vulnerable and even defensive. The sisters did not rush to deal with this defensiveness. They finally comprehended the fact that change always feels like a loss to the people living under the previous dynamic. It didn't make them cruel, though, it made them stable. They stood their ground without hardening. They listened rather than retreating. They let a conversation close rather than closing it if closing it meant self-betrayal. This represented a new form of strength, not the strength of endurance. Definitely not the strength of silence, the power of presence. Being means being connected to oneself, even when the contact was uncomfortable. Being means trusting that a relationship based on mutual respect could withstand the truth. And if not, that was information, not failure. Living without apologies also impacted how the sisters felt about conflict. Conflict ceased to be something that they wanted to completely avoid. Instead, it became something they could understand. Something that disclosed values, boundaries, and even expectations. They ceased treating conflict as an indication that something had gone wrong. Sometimes it was simply a signal that some change was occurring, Bloom says. Yet they also learned change is not always a gentle process. The sisters grew more particular about where they chose to spend their time emotionally. They stopped trying to connect with everyone where they were. They started meeting people where they were, down to earth, straightforward, and uncompromising. It brought peace. It brought peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on silence, but the abiding peace that comes from alignment. They knew the difference in their bodies, in how they slept at night, in how they spoke during the day, in how they made decisions without doubting them later on. However, life without apologies was not ever perfect. It made it honest. And honesty, once inculcated, forms a foundation robust enough to support both connection and distance simultaneously without imploding.
With honesty firmly in place, the sisters started to feel a quieter confidence emerge. It wasn't a confidence that screams its presence or calls out for attention. It was a confidence that existed internally, was consistent, and had roots deep within themselves. They believed in themselves for the first time. not based on any revelations of answers, but based on no longer abandoning themselves. This confidence transformed the way they moved through their everyday experience. They ceased to survey rooms for emotional signals. They no longer changed their tone in order to forestall discomfort. Now they did not have to justify what was or was not important. They spoke, and then they waited. Waiting used to be a dangerous experience. Waiting for silence used to be the same as waiting to see whether one's work qualified as a special kind of failure, better known as an artistic choice. Now, silence was essentially a placeholder experience, a space where something might occur or not occur, with the sisters remaining earthed in either case. They noticed something else as well. As they ceased apologizing unnecessarily, they became less reactive. Without the need to soften conflicts, they could listen instead of defending. They could express disagreement without escalating. They could disengage without guilt. This adaptability in emotions helped make relationships clearer. However, some linkages strengthened because of mutual respect, rather than a need for compromise. There was a sense of parity in conversations. Two-way accountability was at play. There was a sense of replenishing rather than depletion within those relationships. All other linkages were, not dramatically, not explosively, they just lost steam. Without an apology in place to hold them up, without constant reinforcement, they simply could not sustain themselves. And that hurt, but that hurt was also the truth. The sisters mourned those linkages in their own private. They mourned for the kind of closeness that required sacrifices. They mourned for the hope that things would be better if they just tried a little harder. However, they didn't confuse grief for regret. They finally realized that sometimes the price of growth is grief. Living without apologies also impacted how the sisters perceived themselves. They no longer defined kindness as self-erasure. They no longer saw empathy as obligation. They understood that freely given love does not necessarily feel similar to love that has been extracted from someone through expectation. This awareness changed their internal dialogue, Jeffrey Lawwell. Instead, I could have asked, how do I make this easier for everyone? They just asked, what is true for me right now? This question became the compass. It informed decisions, small and large. It assisted them in realizing when an action felt out of alignment. It enabled them to move away with no fuss, no explanation, no apology. They weren't closing themselves off. They chose integrity, and integrity does not require constant justification. The sisters felt a sense of relief that they hadn't anticipated. Relief from the burden of the conversations, from the burden of the reactions, from the burden of the responsibilities that were never supposed to be theirs. It brought about space for curiosity, space for joy, space for rest, space to reconnect with parts of themselves that had been silent for quite some time. Living without apologies wasn't about becoming rigid. It was all about becoming real. And in that reality, they discovered what they had not known they were seeking: the right to simply be, without shrinking into the space around them. As the sisters established their foundation of integrity, they felt a difference in their emotional atmosphere. It felt lighter, although not empty, merely lighter. They did not carry conversations with them long after the fact of the conversation itself. This mind noise had dissipated, however. They recognized just how much of their tiredness had been due to anticipation, not actual fighting, but anticipation of reaction, anticipation of disappointment, anticipation of when they might find themselves intervening to control another person's emotion. Not living with apologies eliminated the need for anticipation. For the first time, they believed that the reactions belonged to the people who had the reactions. This trust was subtle, but it changed everything. If a defensive reaction was presented, the sisters did not rush to offer comfort. If a withdrawal, they did not pursue. If a tension, they permitted it to be. They found that the vast majority of the tension will resolve itself if it is not constantly supplied. This was an eye-opener. For so long, they had figured that the maintenance of peace was an ongoing process, that the harmony was shaky, that the silence meant trouble. But now they realized that true stability in life can have its gaps, disagreements, or distances. They had the stability by living without apologies. They also realized how their communication in the past has been affected by having or lacking power in a relationship. The power imbalance has been equalized through apologies, yet in some situations power was not equal in their relationships, but apologies help to ensure that things are balanced in a certain manner. These imbalances were aired, no apologies offered. And of course, their visibility made them impossible to ignore. The sisters did not care about fixing every imbalance. They did not want to fight. They just did not feel compelled to keep pretending equality was an issue when it was not.
This rejection was not vocal. It was quiet consistency. They stopped overgiving, stopped offering reasons emotionally, stopped inserting themselves into roles that weren't mutual. They started concentrating on presence, on being there entirely in relation to themselves, and showing up partially in relation to others. Presence without apology had a different feel to it. It didn't ask permission. It didn't negotiate. It did not contract in size. It just existed. The sisters could see how this presence impacted their experience of time. There was less hurry in their days. Even in their busy times, they could handle them efficiently since they aren't saturated with emotional labor. The sisters could transition from one activity to another with unresolved tensions in their wake. This calm was not accidental. It was deserved. Achieved in the midst of uncomfortable pauses, away from the resistance of old habits, away from the choice of comfort over clarity that happens every day. Living life unapologetically did not mean they never experienced any feelings of doubt. Doubt did appear, even at times when following some of the old patterns of thinking and acting would have been simpler. Doubt, however, did not determine action. They believed in the process. And in the process, they learned something very important. Self-respect doesn't require permission. It doesn't demand an explanation. It just asks to be respected. By this time, the sisters ceased to think about the transition. They were in the midst of living this.
By now, the sisters weren't measuring progress by how others were reacting. That had once been the benchmark. Fewer arguments, smoother conversations, quicker resolutions. Now, the progress was internal. It showed up as steadiness, as the absence of self-doubt following the speaking, as the quiet confidence that followed a hard moment instead of the familiar emotional hangover. They no longer wondered whether they had been too much. They asked if they had been candid. That one shift changed the way they measured everything. And when honesty came to be the norm, apologies fell into their rightful order. They were no longer automatic. They were no longer preemptive. They came up only when accountability was actual and imperative. And because of that, they carried meaning once more. The sisters also began to realize how much of the emotional permission they'd been waiting for. Permission to be firm, permission to disappoint, permission to take up space without cushioning it for others. Living without apologies gave them that permission internally, and once it existed there, it didn't need to come from anywhere else. They noticed now how differently they felt after conversations that once would have left them depleted. Even when the interactions were tense, they didn't feel hollow afterward. They felt complete. There was no sense of having given something away that couldn't be replenished. That was the new completeness. It made it easier to walk away from conversations that went in circles, easier to disengage without guilt, easier to let others sit with their own reactions instead of rushing to fix them. This didn't keep the sisters apart. It made them choosy. They chose where to invest energy. They chose where to listen deeply. They chose where to show up fully. And just as importantly, they chose where not to. It was a selectivity that wasn't about control. It was about care. Care for their emotional bandwidth, care for their truth, care for the life they were building beyond constant explanation and emotional negotiation. They started noticing something else. When they stopped apologizing for their presence, others adjusted. Not everyone, but some. Conversations became more thoughtful. Words were chosen more carefully. Accountability became more mutual. This really reinforced what they were learning. Apologies had once made things easy for others. Honesty made things real. And real relationships they were discovering could handle that. There were still moments of discomfort. Still moments where old instincts whispered that an apology might smooth things over. But those instincts no longer had the final say. The sisters could recognize them as habits, not directives. Habits can be unlearned. By this point, not having to apologize for living was instinctive, not because it was easy, because it was congruent. They weren't at war anymore with themselves. They weren't unconsciously doing the emotional labor. They were here, rooted, whole. This wasn't a phase. It was a new way of being. By the time the sisters reached the stage, living without apologies no longer felt like resistance. It felt normal. Apologies had once been their reflex, to smooth tension, to preempt conflict, to take responsibility for emotions that were never truly theirs. That reflex was gone, and nothing bad happened. No collapse, no chaos, no disaster. That was an enlightening absence. They began to realize how apologies had been doled out like emotional currency, not because they were wrong, but because peace was easier when they absorbed the discomfort first. Apologies had functioned as permission slips, permission for imbalance to continue without being addressed. Living with them felt lighter. Conversations became simpler. If something didn't feel right, they didn't soften it with self-blame. If they needed space, they didn't justify it. If a silence appeared, they let it exist without rushing to fill it. This didn't make them cold-hearted. It made them honest. And the honesty changed the emotional rules of the system. Without constant reassurance, expectations surfaced.
Without automatic apologies, responsibility shifted. The sisters became more aware of how much others had previously relied on their willingness to concede. How much emotional labor had been invisible because it was never withheld. Now it was. They also noticed something a little different, how their internal dialogue had shifted. The old loop, did I say too much? Was I too harsh? Should I have handled that differently? No longer dominated their thoughts. Instead, a quiet confidence reigned. I said what was true. I didn't harm anyone. I don't need to explain. That confidence didn't come from winning arguments. It came from self-respect. The sisters began to realize that apologies have meaning only when they are real, when they come through accountability, not by conditioning. What they'd been offering before wasn't accountability, rather it was compliance. Letting go of that compliance reshaped their sense of power. Power to control not somebody else, but themselves. They no longer measured success by how calm everyone else was. They measured it by how aligned they felt when they went to sleep at night, and that alignment became their compass. Relationships that could meet them there adjusted. Relationships that couldn't faded. Not suddenly, not cruelly, just naturally. This stage of release no longer felt like letting go. It felt like refinement, shedding the habits that once protected, yet were no longer needed. It felt like a leap from a role that required shrinking. Living without apologies didn't mean living without compassion. It meant living without erasing oneself. By now, the sisters could see clearly that wasn't just a behavior change. It was identity change. They were no longer people who required permission to exist as they were. They had learned to stand without cushioning the jolt, and that learning was irreversible.
At this point, the sisters no longer described their development as something they were doing. They were simply in the process of becoming. Living unapologetic had seamlessly integrated itself into their lives. It had begun to dictate how they showed up. They had stopped bracing. They saw it in little ways, refusing to weaken an understatement, to hurry comfort, to qualify truth with doubt. Thus, they recognized all these little acts, and they added up to something that felt solid in a way nothing ever had before. What surprised them the most was the calm of their inner world. There never had to be a calibration process that balanced feelings and that which could and could not be said. No psychological contorting to make truth more desirable. No trailing cleanup of feelings afterward. Such calmness was not by accident. It came from alignment. They realized now that apologies had been a kind of emotional bridge, but a bridge constructed only on one side. When the bridges were gone, some people came out, and others chose to remain where they were. The sisters allowed both situations to be what they were. This was a more profound release than the earlier acceptance. Responsibility for the impact of their own growth on others was not taken by them anymore. Seldom was growth comfortable for the individual who was happy under the previous form of someone. That the sisters understood that discomfort did not necessarily mean that the damage was done. It meant that something had changed. Living without apologies also honed their awareness of boundaries. Boundaries were no longer something they proclaimed or protected. They just manifested themselves through action, through what they engaged with, what they declined, what they let pass unnoticed. Their lives became quieter because of the behavioral clarity. Ongoing clarity, more self-esteem. Fewer internal conflicts. They stopped identifying kindness with accommodation. They realized that respect does not necessarily entail self-denial. And more importantly, they realized that silence does not necessarily mean submission. It can also mean certainty. The sisters also realized that when a lack of apologies became apparent, accountability emerged. Without apologies to cut off a conversation, problems either resolved by mutual cooperation or became patterns that would not be changed. Both had its advantages. Neither of the two occasions called. At this point, the shift in emotions was absolute. There was no looking back on the old pattern or the safe behaviors. Safety had been reframed. It was about more than predictability. It was about integrity. They had faith that integrity would be their guide in whatever lay ahead. It was no act of defiance. It wasn't withdrawal. It was arrival. Arrival into a version of themselves that did not require an answer to exist as a whole. When the sisters got to the end of this process, there wasn't a finish line that meant victory and triumph. There was a feeling that exudes certainty, a certainty that does not seek confirmation, a certainty that does not debate with itself. Living without apologies hadn't made them harder, hadn't made them colder. It had made them clearer. Clear about what they were responsible for and what they weren't. Clear about where their energy was supposed to be. Clear about the difference between accountability and erasing themselves. They ceased apologizing for emotions that were sourced in their personal experiences. They did not apologize anymore for needing space. Apologizing for saying the truth or saying it in a cruel manner was now.
But through the act of releasing the apologies, they regained something fundamental: their voice. No more vociferous voice. I don't think there has been a steadier one. The sisters realized now that, used improperly, apology had been a request for permission to just exist. This was a request for permission to feel, speak, and occupy space without breaking anything. For the sisters, living without apologies meant simply stopping to ask. They didn't stop caring. They continued. They ceased to shrink. However, this did not mean that history had been erased. History had not been undone through all these years of accommodation or silence, but it had all been reframed. These years could no longer be cited as a sign of weakness. These years had now become a sign of strength that had learned to turn inward. There was no dramatic ending to this change. No final conversation. There was no moment of confrontation. No declaration of independence. Only a lifestyle of consistency that did not need any more explanation. They carried on in a new way. They talked less. They communicated with a sense of what was and was not acceptable. They existed with a notion of self that was not erased by the challenges of living. Either things change to encompass this, and none of it is a problem, and the relationship ends, and that was okay. Because the sisters had stopped placing their lives on a foundation of being acceptable. They were constructing an identity around what it meant to be true. Living without apologies did not, in fact, mean that everything. It made everything real. And honesty, once decided upon, becomes the cornerstone of a living that needs no permission, only presence. That was the takeaway, as is not usually learned instantly, not without discomfort, but fully, finally learned. And once learned, never unlearned.